Good morning, everybody. We'll just give everyone a few more minutes to join us.
Good morning, Fiona.
Good morning.
So, ready to go?
Absolutely. I think we will kick off. Welcome, everybody. If I could ask you all just to put yourselves on mute and possibly turn your cameras off, that would be fantastically helpful. Thank you so much. We have got an awful lot of people joining us this morning, which is fantastic news. And I think that really is indicative of the fact that the level of concern in our industry is now palpable. We had 519 people sign up to our webinar on the 20th of July, and 844 people have watched that since. We've had over 270 signed up to this morning's webinar, and we've already been joined by a good number of those. 723 people watched my interview on the 9 the other evening, just on the ASSC YouTube channel alone. And we've now been copied into over 360 emails to MSPs of concerned constituents. 222 non-members have signed up to our short-term newsletter. These are not inconsiderate numbers. This is a massive concern, and our politicians need to understand that it is a huge concern. Just to reiterate, once again, the ASSC is not anti-regulation. It's anti-bad legislation. Legislation for the sake of legislation. Legislation with hidden agendas. We absolutely share community concerns about the impact of tourism in general on local communities, and the impact specifically of holiday lets. It's for that reason in 2017, we called for mandatory registration for all short-term lets with health and safety, plus licensing in areas where there is a demonstrable link between self-catering properties or short-term lets and loss of housing stock. That was in 2017. That would have provided local authorities with real-time empirical data to understand the scale of the activity, whilst also ensuring that all accommodation providers adhere to existing health and safety regulations. This suggestion was ignored. Unfortunately, what we are left with are proposals that are founded on little more than anecdote, often provided by localized pressure groups rather than through objective surveying and empirical data. The 2019 independent research was poor, to say the least, based on scraped data from Airbnb and not actually reflecting the reality of the professional self-catering sector, which now represents £861 million of direct visitor spend to the Scottish economy and supports almost 24,000 equivalent full-time jobs. Local planning authorities, don't forget, already have the ability to introduce planning conditions to protect properties for local residents. Section 75 conditions are just one example. Local authorities also have the ability now to introduce planning control zones following legislation that was already passed as part of the Planning Act 2019 in February of this year. They have chosen not to use these powers. City of Edinburgh Council is the first local authority to start looking at a consultation in order to bring in that planning control zone. But that has to be monitored incredibly carefully in case they introduce a de facto ban for the activity. Since 2017, we have proactively and constructively offered empirical data and policy recommendations to deliver proportionate and targeted solutions to protect communities whilst protecting the professional self-catering sector, which is the backbone to the Scottish tourism industry, the length and breadth of the country. In February 2020, we provided yet more empirical data on housing in Scotland. At that point, the latest available figures from September of 2019 showed that there were 24,314 second homes, 45,583 unoccupied houses for less than 6 months, and an additional 41,000 long-term empty properties that have been lying empty for more than 6 months. At that same point in time, there were just 16,600 self-catering units on non-domestic rates. If we look at the comparison between the impact on housing of our professional sector and the empty homes, and the second homes, it's phenomenal, and yet we are to blame. Today, there are 18,143 businesses registered on non-domestic rates. Let's not forget that in April 2020, these businesses now have to evidence being let for over 70 days. Therefore, you're excluding amateur non-commercial second homes. Going back to the proposed legislation, as a compromise, rather than proposing to completely replace the current draft licensing order, the ASSE has proposed to amend Article 3(1) to provide that an activity is exempt from the license requirement if it is in respect of registered accommodation, and that the registration conditions, essentially the same mandatory licensing conditions, are being complied with. This could be delivered today by the Development of Tourism Act 1969 with no additional legislation required. In other words, it could be done immediately. The ASSE has even helped to develop a digital framework that could be offered to the Scottish Government with no charge to administer the scheme. This would protect professional businesses like yours, whilst also meeting the policy objectives for health and safety. We've got real and significant concerns that legitimate and already regulated in terms of health and safety business owners are going to suffer significant financial loss if these proposals are made law, and it will materially damage the tourism industry in Scotland. We also have concerns that the legislation is legally precarious at best, and we have sought legal opinion on that, which we will be sharing with the Scottish Government in the coming days. It's deeply regrettable that we found that engagement with the working group was nothing more than window dressing. We have seen no evidence whatsoever that the Scottish Government is listening to concerns from those who actually understand the industry and they haven't properly considered alternative proposals to deliver the policy objectives in a way that will not harm the tourist industry, onward supply chains, and our guests. It is the responsibility of our elected policymakers to deliver good laws. This is fundamentally not a good law. Now, I spoke about the legal considerations. Just humour me for a few minutes here. I won't bore you endlessly. The entire consultation process has failed to meet Scottish Government best practice guidelines in terms of transparency, accountability, proportionality, and consistency. More fundamentally, the conduct of this consultation process calls into question whether it is indeed fair and genuine and adheres to the Supreme Court approved consultation requirements. There is a potential illegality under the provision of services regulations preserved in the UK law by the European Union Withdrawal Act 2018. The regulations here protect UK businesses and consumer rights by maintaining obligations on UK competent authorities to ensure that their regulation of service activity is proportionate and justified in the public interest. The Scottish Government has provided no empirical data that there is a direct link between short-term letting and loss of housing stock. Therefore, it cannot be considered to be an overriding reason of general interest. The fees involved. Fees charged by a competent authority must be reasonable and proportionate to the cost of the procedures and formalities under the scheme, and must not exceed the cost of those procedures and formalities. There's also a potential human rights violation here. Protocol 1, Article 1, and indeed Article 17 of the Charter on Fundamental Rights, right to property. We seriously question whether the draft order is compliant with the European Convention on Human Rights. The lack of data to support the draft order further underlines it really ought to be regarded as irrational and arbitrary. There's all sorts of case law to support this. The very short duration of licenses of only 3 years means that interference with peaceful enjoyment is extremely frequent, and again imposes a huge burden on businesses. Article 17 of the Charter provides that everyone has the right to own, to use and dispose of and bequeath his or her lawfully acquired possessions, and the use of property may be regulated by law insofar as it is necessary for general interest. For all of these reasons, we do not consider that objectivity, a case has been made, backed up by evidence, that the draft order is either in the general interest or is only interfering in the use of property so far as necessary. We ultimately consider that the draft order creates a regulatory framework that is manifestly inconsistent with the Scottish Government's better regulation agenda and the principles of being proportionate, consistent, accountable, transparent, and targeted only where needed. I won't go on, but you can understand we have real legal concerns, as well as the basic concerns that people's businesses are going to be closed arbitrarily. I totally hope that you can appreciate the ASCC fully supports a sustainable tourism industry in Scotland, and that we have offered solutions to the various concerns. It is time that this legislation is reconsidered in light of honesty, transparency, and accountability, in order to get the balance right between the needs of communities and our vital tourism industry. We have been assured that the legislation will be monitored and evaluated. That's disingenuous given the lack of baseline data. To suggest that we can amend this SSI later is akin to suggesting that we can send HMY Britannia off to sea, knowing that it has holes in the hull. We all know how RMS Titanic ended. So I won't go on. I just wanted to give you a brief update on where we're at and where we find ourselves. Today really is an opportunity for you to ask any questions that you've got, whether they're about minute detail or just how to respond to the consultation. We're here to do our best to help you to get through this and to help you respond. But our key asks, and we'll go over this at the end, is that you really speak to your elected representatives and you respond to this consultation. This is our last chance to make our voices heard. Mel, I think we've got some questions that were sent in advance of this call. So if you'd like to fire some at me, and I've also got some noted down as well, give me a shout.
Thanks very much, Fiona. We've had some questions coming in, and as you've mentioned, we've got some questions lined up as well, which we can run through. Obviously, you've been dealing with this proposed legislation for some time, and I just wondered if, you know, kind of going back to the first point when it started, I think it was back in 2017. Could you just give a bit of a background into, you know, kind of your thoughts on why Scottish Government are going down this road, and a bit of background into, you know, kind of your involvement over these past 4 years, because I think it is a really, really deep subject. And obviously everybody's really busy with their business. So I think it would just be good to give a very brief overview of, you know, how all of these events have kind of come into force.
That's a really good point, and actually depressing, it goes back far beyond 2017. It was the 17th of January 2016 that I had a first meeting with City of Edinburgh Council, because there were beginnings of rumblings of discontent about holiday lets / our colleagues over at Airbnb, and there was considerable concern raised. So what I presented to the City of Edinburgh Council at that point was our first initial code of conduct, which is essentially a little bit like the highway code. So it highlights legal compliance in terms of health and safety, but also highlights ways that we can operate in terms of best practice, best management, and so on and so forth. Back in 2016, my point was that a lot of the health and safety element could have been a question of communication and education in terms of amateur hosts, which would mitigate against those concerns, but also that it protected an understanding that professional hosts already comply with all of these issues. And we said that if that was supported by the City of Edinburgh Council and indeed Scottish Government, we would allay many fears before they became a huge issue. They didn't do that. So then they had an experts panel into the collaborative economy in 2017, at which point we gave extensive evidence in front of various meetings and working groups. That has been superseded by various different groups and is now where we are today. But essentially, we've been at the table since the beginning, being proactive, constructive, and offering solutions to the various issues as they've come up. Every single one of those policy documents, recommendations, data documents has been summarily ignored by the working group and its predecessors. We've got to remember that the people that are delivering this law are the More Homes Division. So when in 2020, we were assured by the then Cabinet Secretary for Tourism that this was about basic health and safety, and they didn't know what we were whinging about. It's not. This is about housing. And it's just an astonishing situation that we find ourselves in, that they've gone down the most draconian, bureaucratic option available across the whole of the world. This proposal is worse than China. It's certainly worse than anywhere else in Europe. And we have offered best practice solutions, Portugal being the best one. They're just not interested. So what we have now come up with is, as a compromise, is that as part of the exemptions, we are asking, sure, go ahead with your licensing scheme, license all the amateur hosts, fine. But for us, we would like an exemption for registered accommodation, and that those registered accommodations will be registered with Visit Scotland. Does that cover it?
I think so. Thanks, Fiona. And also, just to highlight, throughout this whole process, what ASSC is about and what we've always done is every single thing we kind of underpin with data, which is why we do so many surveys with all of our members and subscribers. And, you know, it's to just get a real feel for the climate and businesses. And we've done that all the way through COVID. And I think what's relevant here as well is the fact that a lot of the information and a lot of the decisions from Scottish Government, it's not always underpinned by data. And I think that's a real issue, because we've always kind of driven, you know, that point across.
Absolutely. And the point is that policy decisions should always be underpinned by data. Otherwise, it's being underpinned by anecdote and supposition. Now, that is not how you deliver good laws. Neil Bennett said in the chat, you know, are there other countries that we can highlight? Absolutely. We have already done so. The Isle of Man's got a very, very successful registration scheme with mandatory health and safety. Northern Ireland has the same. As I've mentioned, Portugal is an example of best practice. So yes, we've offered all of these as solutions, and yet they are very unfortunately ignored to this point, which is why we want to keep reminding. And we've got to remember that ministers and MSPs have got an awful lot on their plates. They've got lots of different, very pressing concerns to be dealing with. They cannot be expected to understand 5 years worth of detail, which is what we understand. But we have to, as constituents, we have a role to educate them, to say, this is the problem and this is why it's a problem. This is not scaremongering. This is not us telling you any mistruths. This is us with real concerns over the health of our tourism industry and of your personal businesses.
Thanks, Fiona. And I think from a huge part of this is the fact that we are dealing with small and micro businesses. And you know, that's the majority of our membership. It is from that demographic. So if we just look at some of the detail within the proposed legislation. So one question is around costs, and going down the road of licensing properties and all the expense and red tape it imposes on owners and councils alike. When a registration option is clearly less onerous and overwhelming, it could solve the problems that have instigated it. So in terms of cost, what are we looking at, and how are we looking at our figures in terms of what Scottish Government are proposing?
Good point. And you've hit the nail on the head. We represent, to the large part, small and micro businesses across Scotland who do not work to a massive profit margin at all, as you'll all know. Now, unfortunately, we don't know what the cost of a licence will be. So we have been assured by the Scottish Government that it will cost between £233 and £377 for the licence for the 3 years, if a local authority wants it to be a 3-year licence. We have no idea where they're getting this data from, but we believe that it's based on a 2-bedroom flat in Edinburgh. But local authorities are also being encouraged actively to increase the fee scale for larger businesses. So if you accommodate 22 people, your local authority will have the ability to charge you more for that privilege. They're also suggesting the local authorities charge for different types of short-term let. So whether it's a a bed and breakfast or a large house on the River Tay, they can charge you different things depending on what they fancy. Now that flies in the face of how licenses should work, which I've mentioned before, should be merely covering the cost of delivery of that licensing scheme. So already we're looking at a discrepancy. On the working group, the representative from Solar, who represents local authorities, said that any license fee will be much more akin to an HMO license. And he illustrated that by saying sort of, you know, I think Fife is 1,500 and Glasgow is 1,900. So on a cost recovery basis, I do not know where they're getting their £233 from, but we do not believe this is evidence-based in the slightest, and it's certainly not evidence-based for a property in the Highlands where any of these checks and balances involve people traveling great distances. So we don't know is the bottom line. We don't know how much it's going to cost the local authority. We don't know how much it's going to cost as the finished fee. And ultimately, that's a huge problem, because also you've got to remember that we already have huge costs associated with the existing compliance regulations. So the fire safety, the EICR, your PAT testing, your energy performance certificate. Let's not forget that, again, living in remote and island parts, these already cost more simply because you've got to get somebody to you to check your compliance and so on and so forth. So we already have significant costs in terms of the cost of doing business. So this fee on top is yet one more administrative cost burden. And there's another issue which no other license is going to be faced with, which is inspection fees. Apparently they're going to charge us they can charge an inspection fee, which is an extraordinary situation. And again, we have no idea what that will look like. So yes, we don't know is the question, but what we're basing on is roughly £1,000 to £1,500 per property.
Thanks, Fiona. Now, a few people are asking about the ASSC proposals for a registration scheme. One point is, why won't Scottish Government consider a registration scheme? And also whether there's whether we could persuade local councils to support registration over licensing. So what are the views in terms of ASSC proposals?
Well, we think that the proposals we've offered are proportionate and balanced and totally meet the needs of what the original policy objective was going to be, which is health and safety. Katie Curry has said, Fiona mentioned a hidden agenda. The hidden agenda is housing. So we think that our proposal would deliver the original policy objective of health and safety. The Scottish Government has said that they don't want to consider it because they don't want to look at a hybrid scheme. Now, our comments on that would be they've already exempted hotels, which, let's not forget, are not licensed in terms of health and safety. They are licensed in terms of the sale of alcohol and food at late night. They have excluded them happily. They have excluded licensed caravan parks. Again, they are not licensed for health and safety. So they're already operating a hybrid scheme where they have exemptions. So we are just simply calling for registered accommodation to be another exempted category. The Scottish Government has concerns that a registration scheme wouldn't be as robust as a licensing scheme. But again, we go back to hotels and other sectors that aren't licensed for health and safety. What we're proposing is something more akin to the landlord's registration, which costs approximately £82 to register rather than said £1,000 plus. It's the same kind of self-certification scheme, self-regulatory scheme, which is far less burdensome, far less onerous. You have to still upload, for example, your PAT testing certificate or your insurance certificate. And then the authorities that are already existing, whether it's the fire service or the local authority, can then do a spot check on you to make sure that you are actually complying to what you're saying you're complying to. So there's a banding, but what we're suggesting is that local authorities simply do not have the resource to come out and inspect every single short-term let B&B self-catering operator across the whole of Scotland. They simply don't. And they've said that. So local authorities have said quite openly that they can introduce licensing, but they don't have the resource to do it.
Thanks, Fiona. And just to mention, we did a webinar last week with Joe Miller from Gilson Gray, and there's some detail on that webinar about the licensing schemes and, you know, kind of different approaches and why the short-term let licensing is very different. And so if anybody wants to watch that webinar, we'll provide links to that, which goes into more information from Joe. In the meantime, Fiona, a few people are asking about Visit Scotland's position. So if you could just highlight, you know, kind of where we are with Visit Scotland on this.
Well, as you'll know, the ASSC works incredibly closely with Visit Scotland all the time on various issues, whether it's COVID or general marketing purposes back in the day when life seemed a bit simpler, and especially now. So I have been liaising at a very high level with Visit Scotland constantly throughout this, because they want to find a solution as well as we do. You know, that it is their job to support our businesses and our sector. So we have obviously worked with them closely all the way through, discussing proposals, discussing thoughts, working together collaboratively. And they are in a position now where they support our recommendations and our proposals. And they are also positive, and the board has agreed that they would be happy to deliver it, but they are part of the Scottish government, so they can't go against what the Scottish government wants them to do. So ultimately they will be told what they have to do, but they are entirely supportive of our proposals and believe that they have the resource to deliver it. Thanks,
Fiona. Just to go over the different aspects of accommodation providers and operators, and who this scheme, what this legislation is going to, you know, who's going to be hit. So will the legislation cover people who let a room out through platforms like Airbnb, and are static caravans in scope or excluded?
So a room in a property let out on Airbnb, 100%, because fundamentally this is what this is all about. This is what they're trying to control. So yes, there are different definitions. You've got home sharing, which is what that would be. You've got home letting, which is when you go off to Italy and rent your property out for a week, but it remains your primary residence. And then you've got secondary letting, which is when you have a standalone property that you rent out, whether it's 365 days a year or not. It's your business, it's not your primary residence. So all of those would have to get a license. Static caravans would be within the scope of the regulations unless they are on a licensed caravan park. So, you know, the detailed guidance goes so far as to say that anything that is immobile, including a no longer mobile tractor or a caravan in a tree, that's my favorite bit, as you'll probably know, will be within the scope of the legislation. So yes.
Brilliant. And in terms of city and rural scenarios, there seems to be no difference made between city, urban, rural and remote. Is there any allowance made for rural and remote in the rules, or are we all lumped in with the problems in the city?
Lumped in. That's a simple answer, isn't it? Lumped in. So this, you know, they've delivered this as a one size fits all. Well, we all know that one size simply doesn't fit all. This is akin to me cutting my finger when cutting a courgette, and instead of putting a plaster on it, I've gone for the full body plaster cast. It's not proportionate, it's not targeted, and it's not going to work.
And also, can you explain control areas within, you know, particularly Edinburgh? The planning aspect of it is kind of separate, but running along the same.
Yeah, unfortunately, this licensing order is actually conflating all sorts of different things, and actually that fundamentally makes it very, very complicated and potentially very difficult for local authorities to deliver. So the planning control zone legislation was voted in and brought into legislation in February 2021. It's now part of the Planning Act 2019 that we dealt with Scottish Government with back in the day. Now, that was a targeted approach. Again, back in 2019, there was a lot of lobbying from a Green MSP to introduce planning as a condition for every single property that was doing short-term let across the whole of Scotland from day one. Now, A, that would be impossible for planning authorities to deliver, and B, it's completely not proportionate. So what they have brought in is planning control zones, whereby the local authority has the ability to introduce a planning control zone in areas of demonstrable link between short-term letting and loss of housing stock. Fundamental problem is there's no baseline data within which to underpin that. So we're again saying you've got your registration, the local authority knows in real time what the property is being used for, and then they know whether there's a need to introduce a planning control zone. The difficulty with this licensing, but the planning control zones are there to give the local authority the ability to control the activity if there's a housing problem. That's the planning bit. The difficulty is the licensing order has now introduced for the first time really and enforcing the issue of over provision. So you're now in a situation where if you're in Edinburgh, even if you get the planning permission, the licensing authority, as in the local authority, can still refuse your license. So they've got two ways that they can say no to you. That's going to cause huge problems. In Perthshire, it probably won't be an issue, but in some areas, it's going to be an issue. And local authorities are having to write an over provision statement policy, but they can't do that because they don't know the baseline data. So what does that over provision policy look like? If you look at it in the same way that licensing, liquor licensing came in, that was introduced in 1976 originally and then amended in 2005. By 2005, they had enough information and baseline data in order to write those over provision policies. We don't have that data. So this is all incredibly arbitrary. And that's again why we think that this is going to be hugely troublesome for certainly certain areas.
And Fiona, just to run through the process that over the last particularly 6 months to a year from Scottish Government. Obviously, it was late to Parliament earlier this year and then withdrawn. The BRIA wasn't produced, so now that's obviously in consultation. So this whole process hasn't really followed a particular set staged approach. It's been worked through in a very random fashion.
It's been stop, start, stop, start. So the original consultation was in 2019, but the Scottish Government commissioned some independent research. I'd say that with a very small I and a very small R, into the impact of short-term letting on communities. Now, we submitted a formal complaint about that back in 2019 because the company that was commissioned to do it, A, is specialises in affordable housing, so they've already got an agenda, and B, they only spoke to 5 professional self-caterers. They spoke to 150 Airbnb hosts and hundreds of disgruntled residents, and they only talked to people in 5 different areas: Edinburgh, Glasgow, Fort William, Skye, and I can't remember the last one. But ultimately, it wasn't representative of the real picture of the sector across the whole of Scotland. And indeed, by not talking to anybody north of Fort William, they missed out 1/3 of Scotland's landmass. So that was, we thought, and then the consultation wasn't promoted, so nobody did anything about it. The 2020 consultation was truncated. It was in the middle of a global pandemic. It was incredibly short-sighted. They had already decided they wanted to introduce licensing, so there was no discussion about alternatives. It was just what do you want to change about the detail. They laid the BRIA at the same time as the licensing order, which goes against better regulation standards. the BRIA should fundamentally inform your discussions about the consultation, not come at the same time as the licensing order is laid. The original licensing order was withdrawn in February 2021 on the 18th because it was universally understood to be not fit for purpose. They then established the working group, and it was the job of the working group to look at the issues that had been raised and look at how the legislation could be changed and look at how the guidance could be laid again to support the licensing order. Well, nothing changed. I was on the working group. I went to every single meeting. They did not listen. Nothing changed. In fact, the new draft licensing order is, if anything, worse than one that was withdrawn in February. So it is disingenuous and possibly duplicitous to suggest that the working group made any material beneficial change to this legislation. So that's why we withdrew from the working group and need it to be made absolutely clear that if this legislation was not fit for purpose in February, it definitely isn't now.
Thanks, Fiona. I guess now we need to look at, obviously we've got a list on the screen of the contentious issues. There's more information in the ASSC briefing document. And if people look on the ASSC news page, we keep that up to date with all information as it happens. And there's lots of information on there. Just to quickly go over next steps, obviously the consultation is in progress at the moment and ends on Friday the 13th. So if we could just quickly run through what we're asking people to do in terms of next steps. I know we've had a huge amount of emails already where we've been copied into correspondence from people that have kind of responded to the consultation. So what are the next steps, Fiona, in terms of how people can get involved?
Well, absolutely. I mean, what we really need you to do is to protect your own business and our sector. So what we're asking you to do is respond to the consultation we've got on the screen here. There's only 2 questions in the consultation. They're doing this as yet another truncated consultation process. This one's only 6 weeks long. It should be 12. And they're doing it in the middle of the summer when you are at your absolute busiest. So thank you to everybody that's here today. Question 1 is about paper 2. Are you confused already? Good. So the first question, what you need to know is about the licensing order, the draft licensing order. What is wrong with it and what can they do to resolve that? So, for example, what is wrong with it? It shouldn't be talking about over provision. It shouldn't be conflating issues between housing and health and safety, etc., etc. How can we resolve it? Exempt registered accommodation. The second question is about the BRIA. That's the business regulatory impact assessment. That is the piece of information that should underpin good law. Unfortunately, the BRIA in its current iteration is not underpinned by empirical data. For example, we have asked the Scottish Government how many short-term lets there are. Well, I told you the detail up at the beginning. In the business regulatory impact assessment, it says that there are 32,000. That's scraped data from Airbnb. That's not a number. That doesn't mean anything. I've got a 5-bedroom self-catering house next to me here. I could have at least 7 listings on Airbnb because I could list the entire property, I could list all the individual bedrooms, and then I could list it again just to get a bit of extra exposure. That's 7 listings. So if 7 listings are just from one property, their 32,000 is blown out of the water. That is not empirical data. What we do have is that we've got the 18,000 self-catering units on non-domestic rates. What we do have is that 1,400 people were eligible to get the COVID grant if they were on council tax earlier this year. God, this year's long. We need to work with empirical data before we start making law, and their BRIA is fundamentally flawed. How do you assess that? How do you resolve that? They get to go out and do the data. How do you get the data? Via a registration scheme. Sorry for going round in circles, but this seems abundantly clear to me. It's not complicated. Find out what the problem is and then work out the solution. Don't try and introduce a solution that doesn't actually have a problem. Oh, so that's part one. And then part two, of course, sorry, going off on a tangent. Part two is we need you to write to your MSPs, and I mean regional and constituency. So you can sign up to if you're not signed up to our members newsletter or our subscribers newsletter, and you want to know specifically about this topic, please sign up to this newsletter and you will get all the data that you need. And then write to your constituent MSPs and regional MSPs and councillors if you know who they are, because it's the local councils that are going to have to deliver this. And if they don't even know it's coming down the road, which I don't think South Ayrshire, for example, does, they need to be told so that they can put in representation to the Scottish Government as well. And in terms of, people ask quite frequently, can you give us a template? I'd love to give you a template. We can't give you a template because then it would be seen as a campaign. And it would be seen as one response to the consultation, not individual. There has to be about your business. How is it going to impact your business? So in our members briefing, we've identified some of the issues that we think are important, whether it's over provision, the cost, the additional burden, all of these things. The investment, for a start, mortgage finance lenders are not going to invest in a sector if their license may be revoked or refused. Are you going to invest in your business if your license may be revoked and refused? This is going to materially impact the quality of accommodation across Scotland. So when you're writing to your MSPs, ask to meet them to discuss your concerns. Put them on the spot. These MSPs don't necessarily know this is an issue. We need to make them know that it's an issue. We need to make them realise that your business, with your personal circumstances, are as important as any other small business across the whole of Scotland. Why are we being thrown under the bus? That's what people do.
I've seen from some correspondence back from MSPs that where, they are raising the issue of, the housing agenda. And, coming back to that and saying that they believe that this licensing scheme will obviously help provide more homes that have been taken away. Now, we've done a lot of research in the past, and we've got our More Than Just Houses report. And I know you're meeting with several MSPs, Fiona, to raise that point. So it's about kind of educating them on our position of where we are and where we stand on the housing subject, and we need to really get that across in terms of it's a very different approach to their perception of what they're deemed short-term lets to be.
Yeah, indeed, absolutely. And for example, there's an assumption in these consultation documents and in the guidance and in the BREA that visitors that are displaced from short-term lets, this actually says it in the BREA, visitors that are displaced may well then go and stay in hotels and hostels, which would be seen as a benefit. I'll just put that on the table right now. So what they're actively trying to do is close your businesses down to reduce the capacity of our sector in Scotland. Now, we have it on good authority via surveys that 49% of our sector may well withdraw from the sector if this licensing goes ahead, simply on the grounds of additional fees at the very least. But you've got to understand that, for example, I was up on the North Coast 500 last week. If they displace these visitors from self-catering units, where are they going to go? Because there aren't Marriott's and all these big hotels up there. They're going to be displaced into motorhomes, which is going to ruin their infrastructure up there. And it's not going to materially benefit the local economies. And it's definitely not going to do very much for our carbon footprint. So they've got to look at the unintended consequences of this. This is not about releasing housing into the housing stock. 33% of the 49% that said they would withdraw from the sector professionally would leave those properties lying empty or use them for family and friends. They then become second homes, which do not materially benefit the Scottish economy. So they have to see this in a much more holistic vision than what they're actually trying to achieve, which is providing housing. If they want to provide housing, they need to build houses.
And also, Fiona, we've had a lot of members kind of email in to say their particular property that is a holiday cottage or holiday home that they rent out is not actually fit as a residential property. So you actually, you know, it's completely different in terms of.
And I'd just like to clarify, when you say fit, they don't mean that it's under par in terms of health and safety. No. It means that you simply wouldn't use it as a residential dwelling. Going back to my example, I cannot sell that because it's part of a Section 75 on this property. There are ways that, you know, they are going to make properties lie empty and they're not going to materially help the housing stock. A young family is not going to buy a 5-bedroom home on the banks of Loch Long. There are massive housing issues. There is a housing crisis, but blaming short-term letting is not the way to solve it. So that is the hidden agenda.
Right. So is there anything else, Fiona, that you wanted to cover off? I mean, we've got quite a lot of questions that are coming through, but I think if we go through all of those questions and answer those separately, I think we've provided quite a lot of detail, you know, kind of in the presentation. There's our other webinar as well.
What I'll do is, do you know what I'll do, Mel, is that I'll collate those questions today and I will commit to having responded to them all and publishing all of this by the end of the day, which I mean midnight, obviously. So I will do that and I will put it on the news page for you to be able to just dip into. But I mean, you know, we really appreciate the fact that you're all incredibly busy and we appreciate your time this morning, but we also appreciate your time in responding to the consultation. In terms of writing to your MSPs, just copy and paste what you put into the consultation or do the other way around. It doesn't really matter. The point is that we really need to get this on the agenda as high as we can. And I've seen some comments in the chat of people saying that people don't really know this is happening. They don't. We, the people here that know it is happening, have a responsibility to raise it to the highest level. And, you know, I do not like confrontation. The ASC does not want to get into trouble with the Scottish Government. We are trying desperately to be productive, positive and constructive in our suggestions and our recommendations. But at the moment, the only thing that we felt that we could do was withdraw from the working group because it was a sham and it was not working. So this is how we can do it, you know, and if you can support us in writing and raising it and talk to the local press, all of these things, then it would really, really, really help us.
And it's about numbers of people that are responding as well. So we really need to just make sure that, you know, if you do have the time, please do respond, because the numbers of responses that go into the consultation and also for MSPs just makes a huge difference. And also, Fiona, just to highlight as well, I know we've had a few emails from people that have said that sometimes our approach might seem and come across as political, but that's absolutely not the case. And I think sometimes, and more recently, to be honest, the language being used has to be a bit more, you know, kind of broad than what we would like, because this is a huge issue, and when you're not being listened to, it's wanting to put that, you know, kind of point of view forward. So I think as things have heightened and obviously moving away from the working group, we've had to kind of approach it in a certain way.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And as I say, we don't want to be confrontational. We're not trying to be difficult. We are trying to protect our sector. And that is our job as the ASSC, is to protect your businesses. So we're doing it in the only way that we believe is going to work. And certainly from the level of engagement I've now got with MSPs, I mean, I have back-to-back meetings for the next week and a half. People are recognizing and people are writing to their MSPs, and it is making a difference. So we will continue to engage with the Scottish Government in as constructive a way as we possibly can, but we did feel that we were just over a barrel and we had nowhere to go.
Well, That's brilliant. I think as the next few questions come in, we'll collate those, as you said, and also share this webinar and the link to the other webinar as well, and all of the four steps on how to respond. And as you say, if we can share this as much as possible over the next few days to really make an impact. And in terms of next steps, Fiona, what beyond the consultation, do you have any idea of how it's going to move forward?
Yeah, so what happens next is the consultation finishes on Friday. The working group, More Homes Division, then collate all the consultation responses and will then discuss with ministers what the outcome has been. The Scottish Government have to report back on the consultation. And then in September, it will be laid before Parliament. At that point, but just prior to that, it will go to the committee. So this is the Local Governments and Communities Committee. It will go to the committee, and if the committee vote it through, then it will go to Parliament. Parliament will vote on it. And if we don't do what we need to do, it will be voted through on the basis of parliamentary mathematics. So we also have a big job ahead of us in terms of alerting the committee members about all of this. And these are the people I'm meeting with over the next few weeks. So just because the consultation ends on Friday does not mean that our job is done. We've got a long way to go.
But thanks everybody in the meantime for all of this engagement. I think the more that we do now and the more impression that we can make, and that's from self-catering, bed and breakfast, those guest houses affected, glamping, you know, whatever type of business that you've got that falls within this legislation, please do get involved and please do share across your networks. Please also make sure that your DMO, your destination marketing organisation, gets involved, because by area as well, we need to make sure that, you know, people are responding to this consultation as group organisations. So please get involved in any way that you can. It'd be hugely helpful to all our businesses.
And we'll let you know who the committee members are as well, by the way, so that you can write to them.
Brilliant.
Thank you so much for your commitment and helping us out and helping you out. And I hope you all have a fantastic day. See you later.
Bye.